Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest DOE Laboratories of the Future workshop. Today, we will be talking about effective teaming and virtual collaboration. Just going to say a few words about why we are doing this project, and then turn it over to our fantastic speakers that we have brought here today. So the DOE National Laboratories lead the world in science at scale and in operating national user facilities. As the laboratory complex enters its 8th decade, vestiges of its World War II roots remain. To ensure that the laboratories have the resources and structures needed to thrive for many decades to come, we are working to create a vision for the laboratories of the future. The overarching question we are posing as part of this exercise is, what would the DOE National Laboratories be like if we had the power to make them any way we wanted? Embedded in this question is a recognition that the DOE Laboratories are widely regarded as unique resources that year after year produce groundbreaking research, a reputation that must be preserved. Beginning in 2020, we've been reaching out to former DOE and lab leadership, current DOE and lab leadership, early career researchers at the labs, and external stakeholders, scientific professional societies, industrial partners, international partners, and more. We are also holding workshops as a way to share the ideas that we've been collecting. We held the first 3 workshops in the fall of 2020, and the 4th in the summer of this year. The first workshop focused on scientific architecture, where we heard about the impact of building and campus design on science. The next 2 focused on innovation, the first on the geography of innovation, where we discussed place-based innovation, and the second was on the mechanics of innovation, where we heard about groups and programs that can assist the laboratories in their quest to transfer and commercialize their technology. The most recent workshop focused on researcher mental health and work-life balance since the onset of the COVID pandemic. We discussed how to move forward in creating more supportive and ultimately more productive workplaces. We are planning future workshops on workforce development, research flexibility, and governance. Today's workshop will focus on effective teaming and virtual collaboration. We will hear 4 presentations where the following topics will be discussed. How do decision-making teams work together effectively? How can virtual collaborative tools help stimulate innovative collaborations? What are strategies for working remotely at the national labs? And what new models of collaborative teaming can be adopted? We are interested in learning how we can maximize collaboration across the DOE laboratories and with our external partners. And we are interested in learning how we can make the most of what has been a very difficult situation with the COVID pandemic. We're pleased that so many of you have joined us today, and we are looking forward to what is sure to be a fascinating set of presentations and robust discussion. Here is our agenda, and unfortunately, Dr. Binkley was unable to join us. I gave you the introduction, and now I will introduce our first speaker, Dr. Nancy Cook. We will have a moderated discussion at the end, so please type in your questions in the Q&A box as you think of them. Dr. Nancy Cook is a professor and graduate program chair in human systems engineering at the Polytechnic School, one of the Ira A. Fulton Schools of Engineering at Arizona State University. She also directs ASU's Center for Human, AI, and Robot Teaming, as well as the Advanced Distributed Learning DoD Partnership Lab, and is the science director of the Cognitive Engineering Research Institute in Mesa, Arizona. She received her PhD in cognitive psychology from New Mexico State University in 1987. She's also recently chaired a study panel for the National Academies on the Enhancing the Effectiveness of Team Science. Dr. Cook was a member of the U.S. Air Force Scientific Advisory Board, and in 2014, she received the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society's Arnold M. Small President's Distinguished Service Award. Professor Cook's research interests include the study of individual and team cognition and its application to the development of cognitive and knowledge engineering methodologies, sensor operator threat detection, cyber and intelligence analysis, remotely piloted aircraft systems, human-robot teaming, healthcare systems, and emergency response systems. And now I will stop sharing and turn it over to Dr. Cook.
Okay, are you able to see the full screen mode?
Looks good, thank you.
Okay, and I am not able to start my video because the host has stopped it, but I will go ahead and get started. So I'll be talking today about effective teamwork for DOE Laboratories of the Future. This work has been done in many different contexts. I'm going to talk a little bit about my research that comes out of the Center for Human Artificial Intelligence and Robot Teaming. So not only have I studied human teams for the last 25 years, but I've also been studying teams that have artificial intelligent agents on them. And it's interesting that when you do that, when you look at the failings of AI as a teammate, you learn a lot about what it takes to be a good team and a good teammate. Okay, a little bit about the context of my research. So I do work in a number of different, I call them synthetic task environments, where we bring the real world task into the lab to study it with teams of participants. In this case, we're looking at a remotely piloted aircraft system research testbed, and I'll tell you a little bit about this because I give you some findings that have come out of this particular testbed. In this testbed, 3 operators are controlling a drone basically to take pictures of ground targets. And in some cases, one of the operators is an AI agent. But these are the roles of the 3 operators. There's the payload operator or photographer, the air vehicle operator or pilot, and the navigator or mission planner. And this is a really great team task because it's completely interdependent, requires interaction and communication and coordination.
Sorry, Dr. Cook, can I interrupt you? Would you mind putting it in presenter mode? You can press Shift F5 or yes, thank you.
Is that working? Do you see it in presenter mode?
It does not seem to be working.
It's on presenter mode for me. So let me do this. How's that? Do you see it in presenter? Is it in presenter mode?
Oh, are you? It's not in presenter mode. Sorry, people are providing suggestions. Are you sharing your presentation? Are you sharing PowerPoint or are you sharing your entire desktop?
I'm sharing, I think I'm sharing PowerPoint. Try it again.
How about if we just maximize it? Oh, sorry. Victor suggests don't share a PowerPoint, share the desktop.
Okay. Sorry about that. We, I think, decided to trust the technology.
I know. Apparently.
I've only done this 1,000 times, so I'm not sure it's not working today. So I will share screen. And now let me presenter mode. Oh dear. I think I have too many screens open. Okay, one more time. Any better?
It says, you know what? Do you want to send it to me?
Okay. Okay, it should be coming to you.
Okay.
I'm not sure why it's not working for me today. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. I think, why don't you keep going, and then when I get it, I'll open it up on my screen.
Okay. Okay, so I described the research context, which is the remotely piloted aircraft system testbed. And what I wanted to do is quickly now, because I'm running out of time, go over 5 research findings that came out of that testbed over the last 20 or so years. The first research finding is the importance of team interaction. And if you could see it, there's a graph that shows learning curves of 11 different teams over time. And part of the message here is that it takes teams at least 4 40-minute missions to kind of become cohesive and well coordinated as a team. So the message is teams don't start off as being an effective team. It takes time. And from research like this, I've developed a theory of interactive team cognition that talks about the primacy of team interaction, often in the form of explicit communication. And that's the foundation of team cognition. I have 2 examples, and I think Susanna's going to be sharing her screen soon with the slides.
It's still, it hasn't come through. Do you want to just go ahead and show the slides as you were?
Okay. Okay, so this is the theory of interactive team cognition that I was just talking about. And there are examples from sports that kind of drive this theory home. One of them is of the 2004 Olympic basketball team, who was made up of a team of professional, highly skilled players who came together to lose pretty miserably at the Olympics. A lot of different speculation about why they lost, but it taught us that a team of experts does not make an expert team. So you just can't bring experts together and expect them to be cohesive from the start. This is to be contrasted with the 1980 Olympic ice hockey team. This is the team in which Herb Brooks and 20 young no-names, not professional players at all, but they were college level ice hockey players, and they went on to win the Olympic gold medal in ice hockey. And this is an example of an expert team made up of no-names. And what was important in this example is that by virtue of a lot of coaching techniques, the coach was able to bring them together and be cohesive and go on to win the Olympics and beat the Russians in ice hockey. There's a movie called Miracle on Ice on which this team's based, but the message here is that it's about the interaction. It's not just about putting the components of a team together to make an effective team. There are some implications, and especially related to the pandemic, team interaction for team effectiveness, that teams rely heavily on interaction. Okay. And there's been a recent move from face-to-face to Zoom interactions, as we all know. And there's a lot that you lose in that, including the ability to show your own slides. But several things that are missing in our current Zoom interactions are serendipity, just running into somebody in the hallway and being able to carry on an unexpected conversation. Also, we're missing in these Zoom days the sharing of food and being able to have sidebars. All of these things have been shown to be important in collaboration, especially interdisciplinary collaboration. But they're missing, and it's really hard to recreate these things virtually. Second research finding is that improving teamwork can be improved, at least in the lab, through perturbations. That there's another experiment that I'm going to talk about that came out of the remotely piloted aircraft system lab that was about team retention and composition. And briefly, what we did is to bring teams in and have them come back 10 to 13 weeks later or 3 to 5 weeks later, so short or long intervals. But what's important here is that they came back either intact with the same teammates or they came back with different teammates. The results of that experiment were kind of interesting. So going on to the next slide, they all but the short interval and intact teams suffered performance loss after the break, which was kind of expected because they had a break. And so you see that teams, they not only learn, but teams also forget. But in the next slide, what was really surprising to us was that team process, which is how the teams are interacting, improved for the newly mixed teams, but not for the intact teams after the break. It was like they flatlined in terms of the way they interacted. And it was the act of bringing new people onto the team that gave them new ways to interact. And they were much more adaptive and better better in novel situations after this. So let me go on to the implications of, we call this perturbation training. We went on to develop training that was just that. We inserted perturbations into the simulation. This is kind of like the idea that what doesn't kill you will make you stronger. When things go wrong, teams have to quickly adapt. And the more adaptations that the team has to make, the more possibilities there are for increased resilience and effectiveness. However, and there needs to be more research on this, of course, there's a limit. If you just keep getting hit with roadblocks over and over and over again, the team probably will never have a chance to come together in the first place. So let me move to the next research finding. What does it take to be an effective teammate as opposed to an effective team? And here I'm going to tell you a little bit about a synthetic teammate. So we had AI sit in as the pilot in this particular experiment. That would be the red line, is this synthetic team made up of an AI and 2 humans. We also had an all-human control team, that's the blue line, and we had the experimenter team, which is the green line. And we found that the target processing efficiency, which really involved tight coordination, was much poorer for the synthetic teams than the control teams. And it was, and the control teams did worse than the skilled experimenter teams, somebody with a skilled experimenter sitting in the pilot seat. What was really kind of alarming in a way is that the synthetic team's processing efficiency target, and this is really how fast they get in and out and process a target, it declined over time. And so what was happening is that the synthetic teammate, the AI, acted as if there were no other team members and did not anticipate the information needs of the fellow teammates. And as a result of that, the humans started to entrain to this synthetic teammate, and they stopped anticipating information needs as well. And moving on, there's another kind of embarrassing example of this about anticipating information needs. When I was in a parking garage years ago with one of my graduate students at a conference, and I was backing up the car, the student said, "Stop." I stopped, and we avoided a rental car collision into a pole that I apparently did not see. He saw the pole, and he was able to alert me to that. and I was able to take action. So it took both of us working together as a team to do this. So on to the next slide. What does it take to be an effective teammate? There needs to be meaningful communication in time. You need to anticipate the needs of your teammates, and you need to be proactive in your response to the task and team, and flexible in the face of change. So we'll move on to the fourth research finding, is about coordination coaching and the power of a single teammate. So in terms of target processing efficiency, again, we saw from that study I just described that the synthetic teammate validation study not only provided assessment of the synthetic teammate along with its weaknesses, and if you can click through, but it also demonstrates how subtle coaching of coordination can improve team performance, because we had the expert experimenter team with the expert in the pilot seat, and they were able to kind of lift the team up. So this is just 1 out of 3 people. And we applied this coordination coaching to code blue resuscitation at the Mayo Clinic. This is a dissertation of one of my doctoral students, Sandra Hinsky. And just by teaching the leader of the code blue exercise some particular communication, the essentials of communication during the code, they were able to have fewer, if you go on to the next 2 slides, they had fewer errors. This is a picture of the what the intensivist code leaders studied, a communication model. They studied it for about 5 to 10 minutes. And then on the next slide, you could see how code team errors were greatly reduced just by that simple intervention. And so this is the leader of the code blue exercise was able to push and pull information from the team if it wasn't coming in a timely manner. And so go on a couple clicks down, the implications of this coordination coaching for team effectiveness. There's this, I think the data speaks to the importance of leadership on a team and the power that a single teammate can have to bring the team down or to raise it up. However, in this virtual world that we find ourselves in, next slide please, the efficacy of the leader may be impacted by impoverished behavioral cues. And so this worked pretty well face-to-face. I'm not so sure that it would work virtually. And finally, going on to research finding 5. How do we meaningfully assess team effectiveness? And much of the work in my lab has been devoted to trying to measure team effectiveness. And next slide, there's a difference between outcome versus team effectiveness. And we know this by looking at, say, sports teams. Particularly, you can look at like children's soccer teams, and you can see that sometimes they happen to win, although you know that they weren't very effective as a team. The same could be said for code blue resuscitation. That often that doesn't work as it. That does not, the outcome, which is the patient leaving the hospital, does not necessarily reflect the goodness of the team, the effectiveness of the team. And the same with science teams. Science teams, the outcome that we tend to look at is the number of publications. However, that does not necessarily reflect the team effectiveness. And so we've been trying to measure team effectiveness by looking at team adaptivity and team resilience. Do teams, effective teams in our mind will respond quickly to a perturbation and will also bounce back quickly from it. And so we can look at the timing and look at the dynamics of the teamwork in which that happens. So we're having, go on to the next slide. So the implications for measuring team effectiveness are that effective teams quickly adapt in the face of change, they're resilient, and they rebound quickly. That's how we are defining it. And I feel very strongly that this is important because we can't change what we cannot measure. So I think it's always good to have measures of effectiveness. And I think I'm out of time, but I have one last slide to present. So in conclusion, what makes a team effective? So team interactions, communications, usually they're in the form of explicit communications, are central. And this may be hampered by our virtual world, which I think some of the next speakers will be talking about. And teamwork can also be improved through experienced perturbations. However, team members, team players need to be good, and to me that means proactive, looking out after your fellow teammates and stepping in even before you're asked. A single teammate can also make a difference as a model for the team and can do so pretty subtly, and that team effectiveness equates to adaptation and resilience. And I think in this pandemic, all of our teams have had to quickly pivot and be very adaptive as well as resilient. And just a caveat there that this research is based on what I'd call action-oriented teams and pretty well-structured task environments. So there needs to be more research to see how this would extend to teams in more complex settings. And with that, I will conclude. And once again, apologies for all of the technology snafus, but I tried to be adaptive. We all were adaptive.
Thank you so much. That was great. And with your permission, I can share the slides afterwards so everyone can see the ones they may have missed.
Yeah. Yes, certainly.
So I am now going to turn it over to Dr. Gary Olson. And I have his slides just in case there is any issue. By way of introduction, Dr. Olson previously was a Donald Bren Professor of Information and Computer Sciences at the University of California, Irvine. And before that, the Paul M. Fitz Professor of Human-Computer Interaction at the University of Michigan. He is currently Emeritus Professor at both UCI and the University of Michigan. His research spanned the fields of human-computer interaction and the computer-supported cooperative work, with particular interest in collaborative technologies and their role in supporting long-distance work. Dr. Olson is a fellow of the Association of Computing Machinery, the Association for Psychological Science, and the American Psychological Association. In 2003, he was elected to the CHI Academy, and in 2006, he received the CHI Lifetime Achievement Award along with his wife, Dr. Judith Olson. In 2016, he received the Lifetime Service Award. And now I will turn it over to you, and it looks like we at least have your video working. So that is it.
Okay, thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay, I'm going to talk about how to make distance work. It's more and more important these days because, I don't. Judy and I have been studying long distance work for a long time, roughly 30 years. And the findings that I'm going to summarize come from studies both of large scale scientific collaborations and also, since Judy at Michigan was in the business school, we had an opportunity to study distributed corporate teams in a variety of different industries. And then you saw the cover of the National Research Council report on team science, and Judy was a participant in that, and I gave a presentation at one of the sessions of that, so we were part of that whole thing as well. We've summarized our findings several times. Back in the year 2000, we published a paper called Distance Matters, and a paper that's received quite a lot of attention. And it was sort of a preliminary effort to kind of synthesize what we had done up to that point in time. More recently, in 2014, we published a monograph called Working Together Apart that sort of amplified on the initial ideas in that previous paper and provided a lot more detail, since it was you know, a much longer document. And I recommend that if you want more detail about the things I'm going to talk about, this would be a good resource. So we know that work today is increasingly distributed, and of course, obviously during the pandemic, we saw a lot of that. And in our work, we've looked at a number of different ways in which people interact. The example on the right side of a person interacting by way of a tele-robot with another person who's in a remote location. We've seen a lot of use of this in telemedicine and other situations where a person can move around in a setting by means of a mobile robot, and that it's a very interesting kind of collaboration. And of course, we've all been through this kind of stuff in the pandemic, and so despite the fact that people have been studying this for a long time, not just ourselves, but a lot of other researchers, it is still a very hard problem, or it's still very hard to do work at a distance. And there's been a spate of papers published in recent times saying that distance still matters, or does distance still matter? And then it qualifies that finding and so on. So there's still a lot of issues to resolve in this area, but I can give you some sort of preliminary ideas about some things that are relevant. So one reason why distributed work is hard, first of all, if you're a distributed participant, you know, especially if you're by yourself, you're often blind and invisible. You're blind to what other people are doing, and you're invisible to other people. And the kind of awareness that you get in a co-located situation where, you know, I can find out who's in the office today, and I can see if they're in a meeting or on the phone or whatever, that kind of awareness information is often missing. Though I have to say that there's a lot of work going on in looking at ways in which you might be able to provide this kind of awareness information in a distributed work setting. It's also the case that when you're distributed, geographically distributed, there may be a lot of other boundaries that are involved, such as time zones is a huge one, of course. We're dealing with that even just today. Institutions can have different policies and practices and so on. And of course, it can be, especially involving international collaborations, there can be cultural boundaries that you have to be aware of and deal with. It is a case that technologies can help. But the technologies aren't the only answer. That you also need the right social practices to make them work well. I think, you know, Zoom in particular is kind of an interesting example of this. It's a good example of a technology that happened to mature at a time when, you know, we had a big pandemic, and it's been, you know, a lot of us have used it widely, not just for work, but for social interactions, for family get-togethers and things like that. So the technologies are important, but they're also you have to have the right social practices in how to use the technologies in a good way. These in both the Distance Matters paper and more recently in the Working Together Apart monograph, we developed kind of a set of categories of factors that affect success in distributed work. And I'll just go through them each briefly. If you're interested in more detail, I again recommend the Working Together Apart monograph, because we have a lot of details and examples in there. One is the nature of work. Turns out not all kinds of work are easy to do at a distance. So I'll give you one sort of concrete example. Google, we did a lot of work with Google and when we were still active in our at UC Irvine, and they invested heavily in building what I would call sort of really state-of-the-art meeting facilities at their various sites. And of course, they have sites all over, not just in Mountain View, but in many other cities. New York City is where a lot of their work is being done right now. And you know, they tried to do software engineering across these sites. And they found a lot of things that could be done, but one example of something that they really stumbled over was when they had to do early design work. They're just sort of at the early stages of a project. You're trying to scope out what this software is going to do and what some of the parameters are and so on. They found that even though they had these beautiful state-of-the-art meeting rooms, when that work was distributed, it was much more difficult to do than if you were co-located. So it turns out that the characteristics of the work can make a difference in whether you can do it successfully. A second factor is common ground. This has several components to it. One is just a substantive component. Do you have the same kind of knowledge? And of course, with interdisciplinary work, this can be a major challenge because people may have the same language but use it very differently. We saw lots of examples of this in our work. But the other kind of common ground is about work practices. Do you have the same style of working, the same work practices, and so on? And you can actually have some major collisions over that set of issues. Collaboration readiness has to do with both why are you working together? And there's a lot of evidence out there that when you're required to work together, it's much harder to be successful than when you work together because you want to work together. Some work done at Carnegie Mellon has shown that some of the most successful distributed teams are those that have been successful in the past. And it's kind of resonates with what Nancy was just talking about, that you can develop the team skills you need for doing this kind of virtual work. And also, another component of collaboration readiness is the building of trust. Trust is a very important kind of social glue for teams to be effective. And it's much harder to establish trust when all the participants are distributed. We did a lot of work on this a number of years ago. And it turns out if you interact with richer kind of media like a video conferencing or a good quality audio conferencing, it's sort of easier to establish trust, although it ends up being kind of a fragile kind of trust. And it is the case that a lot of companies, for example, we did a lot of work with the Ford Motor Company. They really felt that even though they were going to do distributed engineering, designing cars, say, for the European market involving people in different European countries as well as Dearborn, that it helped if they had a sort of a face-to-face get-together first. And then, it was a way of sort of establishing trust and some common ground that can be very useful when you're trying to do the distributed work. And so that's an example of a kind of intervention you could have to make this all go easier. Management, planning, and decision-making. It turns out managing a virtual team or a distributed team, it calls on different skills than managing a co-located team. One thing we've seen is a lot of business schools have realized this, and they're starting to offer instruction on how to manage virtual teams because there's a lot of different skills you need. One important one that we've seen in some of the field work we've done is it's this sort of out of sight, out of mind problem with virtual teams. And a good manager is someone who takes a lot of proactive steps to make sure they keep in touch with the members of the team, not just in virtual meetings, but in between meetings as the work is being done on various components of a project, and sort of being more proactive and trying to find out if people are having difficulties, and if so, there's something you can do to help them, and so on. It was an example of an important skill that we've seen missing sometimes in virtual teams. And finally, technology readiness. When we started this work, we started this work back in the 1980s. And that was a time when not everybody was familiar with email or audio conferencing or video conferencing or text chat systems and so on. These days, that's less of an issue because people are much more technically sophisticated in the kinds of tools that make a difference. But sometimes you can have people who are less experienced with a particular kind of technology. We've seen even with Zoom, a lot of clumsiness when people don't quite understand how to use the technology appropriately. There are lots of different kinds of technologies. Communication technology. So, for example, the kind of conferencing we're doing right now would be an instance of that. But email, chat systems, a variety of other kinds of tools. By the way, the photograph in the communication part of this drawing shows a hybrid meeting where some people are co-located and some people are remote. And we have found in our work that this is a very challenging situation. It's one of the more difficult situations to manage. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done on how to be really effective. I think, again, our colleagues at Google have really tried to work on this and have come up with some really interesting ideas about how to build infrastructure, including even different kinds of meeting rooms to support hybrid teams of this sort. Information repositories, file systems, records of previous meetings, minutes, things like that, all kinds are important kinds of tools for collaboration. Excuse me. And coordination tools. This is, for some people, a little bit less familiar, but we've seen that some teams can make very effective use of shared calendars, for example, so that I know what your schedule is like, you can know what my schedule is like, and so on. Can make a lot of the issues of working out, accessibility, being aware of what people are up to, and so on. Project management systems are another very important tool, especially for very large, complicated projects like some software kinds of projects that we've studied, or engineering projects. And there are a lot of good tools out there for these kinds of things. And then, of course, the infrastructure that supports all these tools. And one of the things we've seen during the pandemic, when a lot of people are working from home, is there are a lot of challenges in the kind of infrastructure people have available in their home setting or wherever they might be working from. And in all of this, as I say, the social practices and how you use all these tools are really critical. And we talk a lot about these in the monograph that I mentioned, the Working Together Apart monograph. I want to sort of give you three things as kind of a take-home message. One is that when you think about supporting virtual teams, it's really important to think about the whole collection of tools you're going to need for this kind of work. And it's not just having good conferencing or good email. You have to think about the whole suite of things you're going to be doing and what kind of support you need for all these different kinds of tools. We've also learned that it can be very helpful to develop early in a project what we call a communication covenant. And this is something, in fact, we've actually had done this actually formally, where we actually have people sign off on these covenants. One is, so that these have a variety of components. One is how to reach each other. We should have, the communication covenant should contain everybody's email address, everybody's cell phone number, other ways to reach each other. And also then you have to have something about how often you're going to communicate. And one of the real frustrations with virtual teams is I send you an email message about something that I think is very urgent, and I don't hear from you for days. And it's very frustrating. And if you develop the practice that even though you don't have time now to take care of whatever this urgent thing is, you can just let somebody know. So I'm busy today. I'll try to get to this tomorrow or the next day. Those kinds of things can reduce a lot of misunderstandings and other social things. How are we going to share documents? We have seen over and over again just chaos is the best way of putting it. Version control problems, naming problems even, or location problems. And in our work, we've made heavy use of Google Docs or the Google Drive technology. But a lot of people can you lose things because you've got a lot of documents that are poorly named, poorly labeled. Even the Google search capabilities don't let you find them. So you have to really work out how you're going to handle all these kinds of things. Who owns each document? Who is able to edit each document? You need some clarification about that. And then just encourage people to get into a culture of asking questions. And people often hesitate to ask questions because they think they're going to look stupid. Nobody looks stupid when they ask questions. There's in a project, there's lots of complications, lots of tricky things. And, it's very important that you ask questions. And this can be a specific part of the communication covenant. We found these communication covenants to be extremely helpful. Just one concrete example is we're now living in a retirement community, and Judy is on the resident council, which is kind of an elected body that oversees or is a liaison between the residents and the management of this community. And one of the first things Judy had them do was put together a communication covenant, and in that case, actually, almost sign them like in a legal way. And this turned out to be very, very important in the operation of that group. And it's been a good object lesson in how important it can be to set these up. A final example of something, this comes from software engineering, particularly agile software engineering, that you get in the practice of having a stand-up coordination meeting. And the standing up part is important because you want to make these meetings brief. And if people have, don't like to stand for a very long time, like you see in the picture on the left. So this is just to coordinate. Where are we on things, and what are the priorities for today or this week or whatever. And these can be very important in doing something like software engineering. Well, you can do these through distributed media, and we've actually done a little bit of this using Zoom. And literally, stand up, and it can be done. You can do, arrange your camera so that you can see you standing up. And so these can be just very, very helpful. A useful summary of our work, we published an article in the magazine Distant Interactions, which is an ACM magazine, called How to Make Distance Work Work. And a lot of what I've been talking about here is described in more detail in that article. Another useful resource, we've been recalled by the Vice Chancellor for Research, along with several of their colleagues here at UCI, to develop support for team scholarship at the university. And one of the major things we've done is build a website. The group of us is called this Team Scholarship Acceleration Lab, or Tcell. And you can go to tcell.uci.edu, and you'll find an incredibly rich set of resources. There's, particularly this section called Team Resources is full of really concrete things you can do to solve some of the challenges in doing teamwork in general and virtual teamwork in particular. And so I really recommend that as a good place to go to get further information about all the issues we're talking about today. And with that, thank you.
Hello, thank you so much. That was wonderful. So next we will go to Dr. Elaine Raybourne. Dr. Elaine Raybourne is a principal member of the technical staff in applied cognitive science at Sandia National Laboratories. Sorry for the background noise. I really thought it was over, but it seems to be back. As a European Research Consortium for Informatics and Mathematics Fellow, she worked with software development teams at Fraunhofer FIT in Germany, the French National Institute for Computer Science, and BT Global Research and Development in the UK. Her research focuses on virtual teams, immersive simulations, and the design of transmedia learning ecosystems. She holds a PhD in intercultural communication with an emphasis in human-computer interaction from the University of New Mexico, and a graduate certificate in modeling and simulation of behavioral cybersecurity from the University of Central Florida. Dr. Raybourne is the Sandia National Laboratories institutional PI for interoperable design of extreme scale application software. Particularly relevant to today's conversation, she has been a virtual remote member of Sandia Labs for over 15 years and leads the Exascale Computing Project panel series on strategies for working remotely. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Rabel. And it looks good.
Thank you. Fantastic. Well, first of all, I want to really thank you, Susanna, for inviting me to participate in this panel. I think this is a really great topic. I'm very excited to be here, and I want to thank all of you who are joining us today. So let's see. Let me just say a little bit about myself that you may not have known from the bio. Actually, I got into this work supporting virtual teams, I would say when I was really quite young, because I was always told by my parents, you can't be in two places at once. And I always asked, well, why not? Is that absolutely true? So when I did my PhD in intercultural communication, I looked at issues of identity and power in virtual environments. And so since my PhD, I've really been interested in virtual environments, interested in communication, and actually pushing the boundary of face-to-face as a benchmark for optimal communication. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. Some of the other work that I've done with respect to virtual teaming has been on supporting virtual teams across different countries, so global teams with context-aware technology, also with visualizing actions in repositories as a way to support virtual teams. And then I spent a lot of time in my career using computer game technology to actually build crucible environments where people could learn about themselves and others. So in everything I've done in my work, I've always put intercultural communication at the very core. And so I think that virtual communication, we can really make the most of it, especially if we do that. So what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is really think about what we've already heard and to reposition how we might be thinking about remote work during the pandemic. So as Susanna mentioned, I've been a virtual worker for a very long time. And so while I was working in Germany and in France and in the UK, I was still working at Sandia. And so that means that I really had to juggle this challenge of being embedded with one group and then remote with another. And so that's why I want to take some time to rethink what we know or what we think we know about working remotely right now and how we reimagine flexible work. And I really encourage you to put some questions in the chat based on what you've already heard from the first two speakers. What questions do you still have? So let's revisit resiliency. And then I'd like to say a few words later about creativity and innovation and how in the X-Scale Computing Project, which is an Office of Science program, we are actually creating a space for informal community dialogue. And then finally, I'm going to conclude with what really ought to be the bottom line up front, which is that to make this successful, to have effective teamwork and to virtually collaborate effectively, we really need to start with collaboration equity. And that includes empathy and inclusion and authenticity. All right. I love to start with this quote because I think that we really don't consider that, many have been working from home, including our past presidents and our current presidents. And so when you think a lot about what it's like to work from home, from working from home in the pandemic that you make a lot of sacrifices. Well, I can tell you from being a very long-term virtual worker, the same is true before the pandemic. You make a lot of sacrifices being a virtual worker, so it's really not something that is for everyone. And so, what is your experience pre-pandemic with remote work? So I would like to argue that you probably have a lot of experience with remote work pre-pandemic, because when you were on travel or if you were working in a building and your team was on a different floor, or if you're working in a large complex, maybe a laboratory, a national lab, for example, or a university or a large industry complex, you're working with people in different buildings. So these are all instances really of remote work. So I'd like to argue that we do have some experience with remote work before the pandemic. I don't believe that we necessarily gave it the kind of attention that it really merits. And I think now is a great opportunity for us to do that. So what's really qualitatively different about working remotely now? So I really love this example. This is a tweet from a climate scientist, Gretchen Goldman, where she tweeted the interview that she was having with CNN, and this is the vision or the image that she wants to project. And this is what we see when we see all the interviews that are happening with people working from home. And then her husband took a picture of her actually giving the interview. And so she tweeted these two images alongside each other. And so in the second image, what you see is Gretchen Goldman's situation at home, obviously with a young toddler, and she's in bike shorts, and she's got her laptop on a chair. And so what does this really say about what's qualitatively different about this experience? So I'd like to say a few words about this. So first of all, what's qualitatively different about what we're experiencing right now is that we're doing it together. This is a collective experience that was unplanned and imposed. We didn't plan the pandemic. We didn't plan to all go working from home. And so because of that, there is a real challenge and stress that just wasn't really there before, even for those of us who are long-term virtual workers. What else do we see in this picture? In the image to the right, what we can really see here is the home environment. And so what this is doing is, for me, two things. One, this is showing us an intimate view of Gretchen's household. And so we have to keep in mind that when we are on these calls and participating with Zoom, we are really being invited into that person's intimate home, especially if someone's not using a filter. Another thing that it tells us is that here, in this example, Gretchen is a climate scientist. So like many of us who are at the National Lab, many scientists, those of us who work in industry, it's a very privileged position where we can work from home. And so this is also an example of looking at the infrastructure for working in the home environment or working away from the office and where we need to make some changes just in general. Another thing it shows us is that the challenge that young parents or parents in general have when they are working remotely from the home location. And so here in this image, she's really juggling a lot of different things. So it's giving us really a lens into her experience as a working mother. And finally, I want to mention what is in this image, but we actually really don't see. She's using a computer. She's connecting wirelessly. She's probably able to do her work as a climate scientist by remoting into her laboratory. That means that she's leveraging all of that information technology and all of those essential workers who have been supporting all of us during this pandemic. And so I always really like to mention that so that we remember that when we think about the context of remote work and about science at scale, it really involves a lot of different people, scientists, support staff, information technology. It really takes everybody to make it work. And I want to thank all of those who have been supporting us throughout the pandemic. So why do we need these strategies for working remotely based on what I said? Well, there's one more reason that actually was happening even before we started to work from home, and that is that our media habits have been changing. And so before the pandemic, you had a choice about how you were accessing your information via different devices, different media. You probably use several devices at home, at work. What's happening now is that you're starting to employ the use of a lot of devices, a lot of different electronic media, a distributed cognition is an approach that was developed by Edwin Hutchins in the, I would say, mid-90s, where really we're talking about distributing our cognition across devices, across media, and across people and environments. And so this is becoming a much more of a trend for us. And this, I mentioned this here because it's a very good thing. And I like this image because it really shows the variety of devices that we have at our fingertips. And so whatever strategy we employ for working remotely ought to include the use of all of these different media devices and ways that we are distributing our cognition. So finally, what's really causing all of this stress right now, and one of the reasons why we need these strategies, is because we are using, first of all, a degraded and overused communication channel. We're all on the electronic communication channel, whether it's for entertainment, for learning, or for work. Not only that, but you're probably in your home experience, you've got other family members using the same network. And so that's adding to difficulties. And plus, I mentioned before, it was unplanned. This change was unplanned and imposed, which means that we lost some agency as individuals. And so all of that creates challenges, but it also creates opportunities. So as I mentioned, being a virtual worker for a very long time, I think that we never really considered how these are fluid scenarios instead of static configurations. So let's take a moment to think about your day as a flexible worker. And so this would be a hybrid work environment. Now, where we are mostly, or where we have been during the pandemic, is a remote first environment, meaning that all of us were working remotely. And that is actually a very equitable situation to be in. And so, there was a question in the chat about, are there any good things that are happening about working remotely or hybrid work? Absolutely. The good things that are happening is that we are really starting to understand a little bit more, because we have so much data about how we can really change the way that we work virtually. And so in a remote first environment, it's equitable and we're using the same technologies. A lot of our Black and Brown colleagues report having fewer microaggressions. So it's a very good environment for inclusion. Let's look at the second image, which is single or multi-site configurations. And here, this is probably where most of us were before the pandemic, where we were working in organizations and either working with our teams, we were co-located, or we were part of co-located entities that were multi-site and we were collaborating together. And so maybe in this instance, we were communicating virtually as well, but we had the access of the co-located environment, which has been referred to as having those serendipitous interactions. And then last, this is where we are now moving toward, and where I believe the most of the challenge lies. And this is in the flexible and dispersed work. And so this is basically the combination of the co-located environment plus a remote first or satellite remote workers. And so this is extremely challenging. And actually, there are some good strategies for how to make the most of that. And so first, I would say that in order to be good at flexible work, you have to be great at remote first. And we'll talk a little bit more about that if you like. So one of the strategies that we've used with the Exascale Computing Project is this introduction to informal community dialogue. So the Exascale Computing Project is a very large program with 1,000 researchers, and it's very exciting. And I have to say, I'm having the time of my life in that program. And we're all working in high performance computing and building the next generation exascale architectures and software. And so one of the things that we noticed when we went to a pandemic situation where most of us were working from home, we noticed that what we lacked was community dialogue. We had formal dialogue, we had webinars, we had ways to interact in large group meetings, but we didn't have a way really to talk together. And so we created this panel series on strategies for working remotely. And so we have done 10 different panels now and in the past 18 months. And they range from topics like parenting and how to make teams tick, and innovation and creativity. So it really runs the gamut. And this particular series has had some good success in our program. It's a really nice way to flesh out the way that our program interacts together. And so with respect to the future of work, because this is a panel on the future of the national laboratories, I'd just like to say a few words about collaboration equity, our empathy, inclusion, and authenticity. And so the bottom line up front actually is that this situation that we're in right now is not perfect. But what it's doing, if we approach it with the right attitude, it can be a way for us to position ourselves to just do some excellent future work that would mean new communication technologies, incorporating more context-aware systems and artificial intelligence to assist with the way that we do work. So I'm really hopeful that there are going to be a lot of innovation that's going to come out of this particular situation. But so for some final conclusions about, and some strategies really. The first, I want to say something about leadership. So we all need to be team players as we are participating in this. But in addition to being team players, if you're a leader, then you need to actually really lead. In a hybrid or remote work environment, leadership really requires looking at a lot of the infrastructure of the communication, making sure you're communicating with intent, very intentional communication. And what we don't want to do is just take the face-to-face environment and then put it in a Zoom call. That would not be the way to move forward. In our new communication environment, it really requires a different set of skills that we can hone. And so the next suggestion I have is to leave digital footprints. So when you're a virtual worker, you have to really create a virtual presence. It's very difficult, but one way to do it is to make your presence known in documentation or digitally. And even as teams become hybrid and dispersed, we are going to have to get better at our digital footprints, at our persistent communication, and also our documentation. And so I've already alluded to really understanding the pros and cons of the communication environment. So this requires a lot of practice. So it's not a matter of just acting the way you would if you were in the face-to-face environment when you communicate online. It's actually really different, and you want to make sure that you're really thinking about the ways that you're able to leverage what you're good at in particular. A lot of times when I talk to organizations about their strategies for working remotely, they ask me about how to increase your productivity at home. And one of the things that I really think is very important is that because of the unplanned and imposed nature of this push to work remotely, we felt a lot of lack of agency, I would say. So we have to be proactive in setting boundaries of what our work is. And when we do deep work and reflect and have quiet time, when we're available for our team members, how we're available, which media we like to use. And also we need to make time for those markers throughout the day, like exercise and even making time to eat. When you work with the different time zones, this becomes particularly challenging, but it's something that we have to do to pace ourselves. this is not going to end anytime soon. We are actually moving into a new way to work. And so in addition to learning new skills, we're really going to have to unlearn our old habits. And what that means is, we can't rely on face-to-face communication necessarily to help us through many situations. So we've got to rethink that. And we also should be looking for new perspectives about diversity and inclusion. And what I mean there is, the idea of being a virtual worker or a remote worker, or even in a dispersed team, not being present can be detrimental to one's career and to your experience. And so as an organization, as a group, we have to really think about ways to be more inclusive. And that includes expanding our mental model about productivity to more of an outcome-based model. I think as scientists, we're fortunate in that it's easy for us to adopt. And then finally, I'd like to mention that we really should keep what's positive about this particular situation, but change what's not. We need to really look at our own assumptions going into this. What have we done well? What have we done poorly? What should we change? And we should really rethink this idea of how we used to do it. I think we're moving past that. And finally, we can take like a page out of the playbook of the Exascale Computing Project, and that is to think about ways to scale small team productivity to a larger set of teams. When you have 1,000 researchers working together to build ecosystems, really that becomes an opportunity for us to think about how we can scale that productivity. And so with that, thank you very much for your time. I have a few resources here. I'd just like to thank my colleagues, in particular, my crew, Lois McInnes and Ashley Barker, who organized the panel series with me. And also I'd like to thank the ECP leadership and the Office of Science. Thank you, Susanna.
Thank you so much. There we go. So our last, but certainly not least speaker is Dr. Francesca Poli. She is a research physicist at Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory working on fusion energy. She coordinates the development of a code for the analysis and prediction of tokamak plasma discharges used worldwide for experimental interpretation and for experimental planning. Poli is actively involved in collaborations with tokamak experiments in the US and Europe and in Asia, and she holds a PhD from the Swiss Technical Institute. Her background encompasses plasma diagnostics, data analysis, and integrated tokamak modeling. She's also a fellow in the Oppenheimer Science and Energy Leadership Program. OSELP is a fellowship program for exceptional leaders from the national labs and their strategic partners. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Susanna, for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for everybody for connecting. I'm really giving this presentation on behalf of the Oppenheimer Science and Energy Leadership Program. So this is really our story. But first, who am I and who is the group? So the Oppenheimer Program is sponsored by the National Lab Director Council. It is meant to be a network of emerging leaders. It gives the group opportunities to visit the labs, to interact with the lab leadership, and to understand how the DOE complex works. So this is really our story. This presentation is our story. Who am I? I am a plasma physicist, and it is fair to say that I've worked in remote teams almost my entire career. You can hear from my accent that I am from Europe, and I've worked in Europe, in Italy, Switzerland, England, before moving to the US in 2010. This is the reality of fusion. It's an international project, it's a challenge by nature, but it's also a collaborative effort by need. So what does it look like working with remote teams? As my boyfriend, it's connecting at dinner time after your daily shift on a US experiment, when experiments start on the other side of the planet, and connect with your laptop and check that your diagnostics that you have installed on the tokamak in Korea is taking data. It means conducting experiments from a virtual control room. Here on the right is an example, a remote control room funded by the Office of Fusion Energy, DOE, at General Atomics to enable participation of US collaborators into experiments in China. And this is really replacing jet lag with sleepless nights. But remote teaming is also about creating relationships across the border. So this is us, the Oppenheimer group called forth during our first visit in person at the laboratory in New Mexico. And this was our visit to Sandia. And then 2 weeks after we started the program, the pandemic exploded. And so we had to move remotely. And this is where we ended up after months, still together, but virtually on Zoom, maybe a little bit tired, but still smiling and happy to share this experience. And we asked ourselves, would this have been different if we didn't have that 1 week to spend together in person and create connection, get to know each other? Of course, it wouldn't be the same. We also realized that we had a unique opportunity to make an impact. As a group, we started to think how we could be more effective. We had to deliver a product as part of the program, and we have to pick up some challenge that the DOE complex faces and analyze and offer solutions. So this is what we call our think pieces. As managers of groups, we reflected on how our team could remain productive and how we as leaders should change our leadership style to this situation that was evolving, really a dynamic situation. And then as future leaders, we reflected on how new technologies could and should be used to enable and facilitate interactions across the DOE complex. So we started asking ourselves what we would like the DOE lab of the future be? How do we want to collaborate? And so this really was the theme for our thinking. But we managed to do something that no other cohort had done before. It is difficult to visit all national labs in person over 1 year time, but we managed to do it with our virtual visits. So some of us estimated that there were thousands of email exchange, hundreds of hours visiting remotely the lab, and it was fun. So we had colleagues that were in the lab showing us the user facilities with their iPhone, with iPads. It was challenging, but it was really fun. We had hundreds of hours of meetings to discuss our think pieces. We did even manage to have happy hours and Slack training. So you can say that we tried a lot of different software platforms for virtual meetings. It's interesting that with all these choices, cell phones were really the last of the choices. So this was an interesting finding for us. So with all these choices we asked ourselves, would it be nice if there were one single tool that all labs agree on using? Because we found sometimes we had to use Zoom, other labs couldn't use Zoom, or we use Microsoft Teams. And things have changed since. So now DOE has an approved tool, Microsoft Teams. So decisions have been taken, things have moved forward to enable really these virtual collaborations across the national labs. It was mentioned before by Dr. Raybourne about having many options. And 2 weeks ago, there was an article on the Harvard Business Review about the quantum leak. So it was a survey published by McKinsey in October 2020, where the finding was that many companies had adopted as much technology during the previous month because of the pandemic as they had adopted in several years. So this is what they call the quantum leak. And another study by Cornell University finds that 4 out of 10 employees think they're spending too much time switching about different tools. And this is true. Myself, I have Slack on my personal laptop. I have other apps on my iPhone, and then I have the apps that I use on my lab computer. And you have to move tools from one app to another. So several employees find that this switching is really a drag on creativity. And the survey found that on an average day, workers are spending about 1 hour searching through different tools for the information they need. So there are advantages into reducing sometimes the number of choices. With all this thinking, we recommended to the National Lab Director Council an exchange program, a program that should be flexible to support a diverse demographic, that should be hybrid, to allow on-site in-person work at the host lab, but also virtual work with the home institution to minimize disruptions. Of course, a program like this has challenges, and we have thought about these challenges. You might thought that we came up with this recommendation because we were not able to spend time in person and we were missing that, probably. Maybe this was one of the reasons. We started really valuing the importance of collaborations across the national labs. We even experimented with software to see how this could work. And this is us. So faking an interlab conversation with our alter ego standing in the same room. And this was part of the fun that we had during this year of the program. So how could this work? How could we do a better job of partnering? So different labs have different contractors. So perhaps a way of making this work is having a virtual management and operation contract. This is not the usual contract, and it shouldn't conflict with existing MNO contract. But it's really an organization that is designed to serve the entire national lab system, to enable connectivity, mobility across the lab, and efficiency. A system that could hold people's retirement account and break down barriers that sometimes are an obstacle to allow mobility and collaborations. We've been hearing about hybrid work, and all national labs are embracing hybrid work at different levels. Of course, this depends on the mission of the lab. And so there are user facilities that need personnel on site to make sure that things work smoothly. But the lab are working on more flexibility that goes from having a fully remote option to fully on site to hybrid options. What is important, I think, is that this has forced us to think about equity and inclusivity in a different way. And the focus now is really moving from the job itself to the employee and helping the employee to be effective, making sure that the employee can work and is happy. So it's really focusing on the employee. We are rethinking office spaces and meeting rooms. Who doesn't need an office anymore? A colleague was saying, is my office a place for my trophies? It shouldn't be. The labs are thinking about a more flexible layout, not just offices, but solutions to enhance interactions and creativity. Some labs are experimenting with new meeting formats. So during hybrid meetings, everybody should have a laptop and look at the camera, both person physically in the room and person connected remotely. And other labs are giving iPads to everybody, so to facilitate collaborations and to help with these interactions. But all this is really making sure that everybody in the room feels they belong. I love this picture when I saw it on the business section of the New York Times at the end of April. So this is really the final vision for making everybody feel the same. Probably not applicable to the national lab and large virtual meeting settings, but you get an idea of what the goal is, what the employee needs to feel. Our labs are user facilities, and these user facilities serve the domestic and the international community. They have to be productive, so productivity is the focus. How is this going to change? How did it change because of the pandemic? And how is going to change in the future? How we're going to redesign the user facilities. And this was not just a response to the pandemic. Maybe at the beginning this was, but it was really an opportunity for the labs to start planning ahead, redesign the upgrades of some of the facilities. And we like to think about it really as a 3-step, if you want, where the most immediate need is how you interact with science, your immediate material need. You need to run your experiments. You need to check the data. So this has led labs to find fast solution and change policies. For example, at the BeamLife facilities, opportunity for enabling mailing samples to the experiment and then having the samples sent back. Installing remote handling capabilities where possible, and then including remote handling capabilities as the default for the new facilities and for upgrades to existing facilities. Enabling virtual participation, and this goes from providing laptops to collaborators up to pushing toward creating virtual control room. Then you get to a level of scientific exchange. And this is really what fits the intellectual needs. the data handling, the transfer of data, how the data are shared, how the data are accessed real time. And then you get to the scientific argument. We are human beings. We like to discuss about science. We like to be in the room and argue with each other. And this leads to choice of adequate, smart virtual interaction tool that can replace or maybe not replace, but facilitates this type of interactions. And Dr. Olsen, Professor Olsen was saying that in the end, everything comes down to how can we really build trust in a virtual environment, because it's not easy as creating trust in an in-person environment. The pandemic has forced us to think beyond our comfort zone, to reconsider the future of the workplace, understand that being inclusive has many meanings, is a multifaceted problem. It has forced us to embrace asynchronous work. And it has inspired us, the Oppenheimer cohort, to reimagine how we would like collaborations across the DOE complex to look like as a global network, collaborative, not competitive, maybe competitive at the right level, a collaboration that breaks down barriers. I would like to give an example of from my own world, which is fusion, of an experiment that has been designed, keeping in mind that is going to be a remote team capability. And this is ITER, the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor. It's a project with 7 international government agencies as partners, being built in France. How are the United States getting ready for it? By enabling fast network for real-time data sharing analysis, so real-time communication, by creating centers for research, virtual control room. And this figure is an example of the innovation center. There is a planned at PPPL, by having high performance computing super facilities to store the data mirrors, and to distribute the data. So storage, analysis, visualization. And so with this example, I would like to conclude with a thought that there is no virtual tool, no matter how smart it can be, that can replace the power of human bonding and building effective remote teams and long-lasting collaborations. Similar to Dr. Raybourne, I've been working in a remote team for many years. But if I can be effective in this collaboration is because I share something in common with my colleagues. We have shared something. It's because I'm sitting on the floor with my Korean colleagues eating spicy food. It's the walking the Great Wall with my Chinese colleague and then exhausted at the end of the day, sitting around the same table, sharing some hot soup. So this cannot be replaced by any virtual tool. And I want to conclude by thanking everybody who make this Oppenheimer program a reality. Our program mentor, Kevin Doran from University of Colorado Boulder, our VIP mentors, the NLDC sponsorship, and all my colleagues from the cohort 4. Thank you to all of you. It's been an honor working with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesca. So I'm going to ask the panelists to turn on their videos now. And okay, we got 2. Great, excellent. And I'm going to turn it over to Victoria DeStefano to lead the Q&A. And please feel free to keep the questions coming, put them in the chat or the Q&A. And thank you again.
Yes, I was just going to say thank you for your wonderful presentations. It was really interesting, and I'm excited for the conversation that we're going to have today. So I know that there are some great questions in the chat, but I'm going to go ahead and start with some pre-prepared questions. As Susanna said, feel free to go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. My first question is, Dr. Olson, you talked about a lot this communication covenant and kind of putting into formal words within a team, you know, what the communication practices are. We've heard a lot about collaborative agreements and other discussions. And I guess beside the communication covenant, what else would be included in some sort of collaborative agreement to enhance team science?
Well, I think, I mean, the concept we have of what the covenant includes a lot of things. I mean, things like how you can do data management, things like that. How you're gonna, you know, manage all your documents, all your materials. Could even get down to the details about what tools you're gonna actually use. The kind of thing that Francesca was just talking about. And so, you know, I think the idea of establishing some agreements among the participants early, but also you have to think about the covenant as being a living document, because as you work, you're going to learn things and you're going to want to change things and tinker with it and so on. So just realize even though you put it together at the beginning of a project, it's not set in stone. It's digital, and you can change it and modify it as you get experience. So it's just a way of sort of establishing some level of agreement among all the participants into how they're going to actually carry out the collaboration. And, you know, it could well be you're going to encounter things that we haven't even thought about yet that you have to get some agreement on. So I think the fact that it's a living document is the important idea.
If anyone else has would like to speak on that, just let me know. I wanted to ask also, this is one of our questions from our audience, you know, the idea of serendipity gets brought up a lot, that things that remote teams miss out on. Are there any ways to measure this? I think this was particularly directed at Dr. Cook.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think if you looked at sort of over time, the social network and who's been communicating with whom, and tried to then associate different communication or interactions with productivity. But that said, I haven't attempted to do anything like that. And I think it would be fairly challenging.
Does anybody else? I know this idea of serendipity, especially in, you know, building community or collaborative teams, is really important. Anybody have anything to say on that with regards to science teams?
I have just a thought about serendipity. We actually talk about this a lot in the panel series. A lot of our scientists really miss their encounters with colleagues in the office, and they miss the conversations in the hallway. And that seems to be a very important part of the way that we do science. And, you know, I think that we are really at a moment where we are learning what it is about serendipity that we can support with virtual tools. I think that virtual reality will have a big impact here and can be a game changer, actually, where serendipity is concerned. And also, I think that we want to also think about, when we talk about serendipity, how many times do we go up to a random office member and just start a conversation? We need to really unpack what we mean by that. You know, you're probably taking a serendipitous encounter to talk with someone that you already know. And so that means that you've already established some really good communication or trust, or you have an organizational culture that supports that. So I don't think it is as simple as the technology. I think that this is a very rich area of research. And I think we're going to really see some really interesting things come from it in the future.
Yeah, to add to this, and also to answer one of the questions that I see here is whether anybody has used GatherTown. So when we experimented with software within our subgroup in the Oppenheimer cohort, we were trying Virbela. And Pacific Northwest had made Virbela available to its employees. And so we were allowed as a cohort to use it. And it was fun. So you had your hologram sort of working there. So you have offices. You can set in I am away, so nobody can disturb you. That is really leaving a software running in the background. People knows when you are in the office, when you are available, when they can come to you. And we thought that this is probably what we got as close as possible to serendipity. So it's, yeah, so.
There was a lot of work done back a number of years ago by Xerox PARC on having always on video connecting people. And it's kind of like, you know, making you more aware of what you would know in a co-located setting. Because, you know, if I walk by a suite of offices, I can see who's in and who's out and who's busy and who's, you know, available for a serendipitous encounter. And, you know, certainly collaborations involving hundreds or thousands of people, that's probably a little bit impractical to have always on video, but it is this idea of having constantly updated information about what people are doing can be useful. I know there's been some work, we did some work with a company called Sokoko, where they had a kind of visual model of a workplace with people in, and this was supporting virtual teams where people were, in this image, they had an office and it had a door that you could have open or closed. There were some informal spaces like something analogous to a coffee room or something like that. And so you could get, you know, with it, say if you had a team of like 10, 12 people, you would know, you know, who's around right now, who's busy, who's available to chat and so on. And they were doing it kind of symbolically through a kind of virtual world thing. And they had some success with it. I know that there's another successor to that kind of idea where, in fact, you just, if you saw someone was available, you just click on their icon, and you instantly establish a video connection with them, and you could chat or whatever you wanted to do. So I think there's some ideas that are out there that can be used to make some level of serendipitous stuff happen even virtually.
Yeah, to that point, I think that we've been looking at these types of encounters for many years. I remember earlier in my career, I did some work with in the UK with British Telecom, and we were looking at when you type, you know, you could be typing at your desktop using key terms, and someone else in the organization is using key terms, and then suddenly the virtual environment puts the two of you together. And then from there, you can open up a chat or you can open up a video meeting. And I was brought in as a social scientist to work with them because what they noticed was people don't go up to strangers and just start talking. And so that's when we published a paper on cultural signposts in virtual environments. And I'm happy to share that with anyone that's interested.
Really interesting. I mean, this is a discussion a lot around, you know, completely virtual, but we've also talked a lot about the hybrid approach, half virtual, half physical. And I'm wondering if there are any tools or ways to kind of make that kind of environment a little bit easier.
Well, I don't know if you, you know, I'm not going to go the route of tool first. because I think that really it's incumbent on all of us to make that work. And it's going to be a lot of work. We're going to have to really think about how we include those that are not co-located. And it's going to be extra effort to think about. I think the ways that we can actually make hybrid work that is, incorporating tools, as I mentioned earlier, is if you can do remote well enough, and if you do that really well, then it should help hybrid. So you should be using documentation. You should be having some redundancy in communication where people can go and get the same information in different places. We need to start thinking about ways that we incorporate the technology into the way that we communicate our work and how we do our work, and making it more transparent. And that's something I actually forgot to mention, but I think that a lot of the discussion around preserving our cultures has to do a lot with how we can make our organizational communication and our processes more transparent to the workforce.
Well, I think there's, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
So one thing that we discussed also along this line is, so when we go back to work, how do we maintain that muscle memory? So can we ask people to take 1 day or 2 days from time to time and work from home so that we don't forget what that like?
So kind of, following up on, culture is very important. Remote collaboration can be very difficult for young professionals getting into the laboratory. And so Dr. Babu asks, how do we manage this transfer of legacy knowledge, especially within a lab environment?
Well, as one of the lab representatives, I think that one of the ways we do that, first, when we onboard, we really think about onboarding someone, if possible, in the co-located environment as well as virtually. And the other thing that we do, honestly, has to do with cultural signposts in our the way that we digitally represent ourselves. And so allowing someone to be able to see the culture as it's expressed through the digital environment, I think will go a long way for onboarding new staff. Mentoring is really important as well. Networking. These are some of the best practices that we're really starting to see used and focused on much more. Employee resource organizations. So I really think the laboratories are really paying a lot of attention to how they onboard new and early career staff.
If I can add to that, so, and what you say is true, and we have also started worrying about the early career stuff. So when you hire a postdoc for 3 years and you end up staying 2 years working from home, these young scientists are really losing opportunities for traveling, for being to conferences, for networking. And we are soon going to see these effects, these negative effects on their career. So we really make an effort, and I'm sure the universities are doing the same, really make an effort that your onboarding really includes a well-thought process of helping these young scientists to create the network. So because these in-person experiences, nobody's going to give them back. And so there will be a problem with having these people enter the workforce.
So and a bit of our discussion has been on the importance of leaders in virtual collaborations, as well as just collaboration in general. Are there some key traits that you've seen that you can measure in leaders within teams that help them form effective teams?
Yeah, I think I mentioned the example about being proactive and realizing that if your team members are scattered around and you don't always know what they're up to, that taking some steps to just check in with them on a regular basis. I think it's understanding the challenges that there are in these kinds of teams. So really being aware of the fact that that like establishing trust is more difficult, or establishing team practices is more difficult, and so on when it's all virtual. And just educating yourself about the kind of steps you need to take to deal with those kinds of issues, because they're not just going to happen spontaneously. And so I think that's one reason why business schools have started teaching virtual team leadership, because they need to learn some skills that isn't just always obvious what you should do.
So there's been a lot of kind of discussion and questions in the chat about the exascale computing project specifically, and some of the best practices you may have learned, how you have, dealt with such a large project. And I'm sure the ITER project can also talk on virtual collaboration on these large projects. But also, if any of the ECP has bench scientists, how are they able to be kind of incorporated into virtual collaboration?
Yeah, I really appreciate all those questions about that. It's really my pleasure to talk about it from my point of view as a social scientist embedded with the project. And so I think that what we've been able to see in our early research is that, first of all, the ECP leadership does a really great job of describing what it is that we're doing and why we're doing it. And so being able to communicate that intent at the top levels of leadership is really important, especially when you have a virtual organization of about 1,000 researchers. And so, that's been some really great work done by Doug Cothe and Lori Diachin. And also, I mentioned that, we have an opportunity in ECP to really catch up with information that's been disseminated, or to get information in many different ways. So we have, if you think about how we have used a transmedia approach to communication, the ECP communicates with podcasts, social media, webinars, the informal dialogue, community dialogue, which is the panels. And so we've got those, at least 4 different ways that you can have different levels of communication, ranging from intimate, informal, all the way to very formal, large group discussions, those that are recorded, those that are private. And so it's that mix of communication that really is robust and is a best practice. The other thing I wanted to mention is that in its design, the exascale computing project has a group that I'm part of, which is the interoperable design of extreme scale application software ideas. And one of the things that we do is we work on productivity and training. And so the ECP offers that for all of the researchers in that organization. And so there are some very good decisions that were made in setting up the program, some very intentional ways that the program communicates, and just some really great people that are really being thoughtful about how they bring their teams. Now we're talking about the small team to the remote environment. And with respect to bench scientists, that has been something that we've been wanting to discuss in the ECP panel series. How do we do experimental science remotely? And so more to come on that topic, but thank you for the question.
Thank you. And we've gotten a lot of interest in, the exchange program across the DOE National Lab. So Francesca, I wanted to ask you, have you, as a group, did your group identify some challenges and ways to kind of overcome challenges for kind of implementing an exchange program?
So some of the challenges we identified were closely related to the MNO contracts. So the different labs are managed by different entities, either universities or consortia. So, and moving across lab would mean how you move your pension scheme. So, and this is where we thought that having something that is above this and not depending on any lab might help. The other challenges and barriers that we found is it's interesting that there was no agreement on what virtual platform each lab is allowed to use. And this is why sometimes we were meeting on Zoom, sometimes on Microsoft Teams, sometimes on WebEx. So challenges go from technical challenges and easy to fix problems to challenges that require an overall organization. So, for example, is benefits and pension schemes. So this is what we discuss about that. I'm sure there are other challenges that we haven't thought about.
So we have only 3 more minutes left. So I guess a kind of short question, maybe not short, but if you guys think of the main collaborative elements, or I'm sorry, the main elements for a collaborative culture, what would you kind of envision those being at the labs?
Victoria, do you mean are you asking about like a personal or an individual characteristic that fosters that?
Or yeah, how can we make the labs more collaborative environments? Maybe focus on that.
So I think I'll answer really quickly since we don't have too much more time to allow others to follow up. So from an individual perspective, I think being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes and to think about what it's like when you are interacting with them if they're remote and you're not. That's one way to foster a culture of collaboration. And another way is to look for opportunities to engage with each other across perceived boundaries.
I agree. And that the more you collaborate and the more you interact with your colleagues across lab, the less you give a priority to competition. So it's really a DOE complex. It's not DOE labs that compete with each other. And this is why these exchanges and collaborations are so critical.
Okay, well, if the rest of our panelists don't have anything to say, I think I will pass it back over to Susanna.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Victoria, for leading the Q&A, and thank you to all of our speakers. We will, assuming we get permission, put the presentations up on our website so we can view those later on, and stay tuned for our next workshop, most likely in December. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Susanna, team.
Bye-bye.